We go. Oh no, it didn't go to the right one. Switch. There we go. That's better.
Hey!
There's always some sort of like demo god sacrifice we need to make before these shows. It's all right. Hey everybody, welcome to the Kessel Chat. Thanks for joining for another episode. We have some awesome news today. As you can see, we have a special guest. Joanna is joining us. Joanna, you want to say hi?
Hello! Wonderful to be here. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ryan. I'm super excited about getting to talk about Star Wars and myth.
Yeah, it's going to be so fun. And Ryan and I have been talking about stuff like this. I mean, topics like, I wouldn't say we've said mythology, I think, a few different times on the show, but I think the way that we like to get into the storytelling sides of Star Wars and stories just in general, it just was like a natural progression to like, there are so many, not just like mythological foundations for Star Wars as a story overall, but the cultures within the various cultures within Star Wars have their own mythos that are talked about a ton between the Jedi and the Sith and the Rakata and the Infinite Empire and like all these other like cultures that have actually been built out a lot. Really could use some more justice. I think it'll be fun.
Yeah, I'm like super excited, Joanna, to have you on the show today. I feel like we should probably start by having people get a little bit of background on kind of your history, not just with Star Wars. We were just talking about some of your knowledge of the original trilogy, but it'd be great to hear kind of your background in mythology, because so much of Star Wars is kind of steeped and like most great fairy tales, borrowing from so many other myths to kind of make it work.
Well, let's say building on instead of borrowing from, right? But yeah, absolutely. So I am a mythologist, which means that I study mythology, right? The big and most important caveat to start with is that when I talk about mythology, I'm not talking about lies, right? Like a lot of times people think, oh, it's a myth, that means it's a lie. me and all the mythologists who I know sort of flip that on its head. And when we talk about mythology, we're kind of looking for the truths behind the metaphors of myth. So we think of myth as, if you want, lies that tell the truth, right? And so that was my graduate work, was studying mythology and fairy tales and all kinds of related systems like that. And then my dissertation was on creation myth. So creation myth is an area that I'm really interested in.
That's who I love. I love the way you put that. That lies that tell the truth. Not lies. Or how did you phrase it? Is that what it?
Lies that tell the truth. And I'm not the first one who invented that. I think there's, it's some famous writer. I can't remember if it's Faulkner or who, but other like fiction writers use that phrase too, and it's very much the same gesture, right? Poetry, fiction, movies, art. It's not literally true, but it conveys truth in a way that a report or a newspaper article maybe can't.
It's the best kind of stories, and using stories in the way that, like, not to demean them, but the best kind of stories, whether it's mythological or fictional, purely in the fictional writing sense. The best stories convey a complex message in a way that an audience can understand. Because if you try to, here's a really good example, and I've mentioned it on the show before, the book called The Forever War, which is a direct allegory for the Vietnam conflict. But it takes place in sci-fi, it takes place in the future. And the book was written to be an allegory of Vietnam, but put it into a way that people could read this and go really kind of get into the emotions and feelings of soldiers that came back from war and how different the world was for them. And the way they tell it in this very sci-fi way, I read it, I'm like, holy crap. The differences in this culture when they come back in these 10-year jumps and 30-year jumps and 40-year jumps, and how different the world is for them, it makes them not even really want to be there anymore. And you're like, oh, okay. It's a fictional story, but it's conveying this thing that is really helpful to understand, but sometimes you just need it in a different context because there's too many layers in the truth behind it to try to give to somebody else if they haven't lived it. It almost has to be a lived truth for that to make sense. So tell them a story to get them to help them understand.
A lived truth. I love that. And that's what story does. We vicariously live out what we experience in the stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, to Jeff's point too about the Forever War, Star Wars itself is like a great analogy for the times in which it was written. And in fact, we've talked about this in previous episodes, that often the Star Wars trilogies themselves are very much a reflection of the time that they are in. George Lucas is talking about Vietnam when he's talking about, and however you want to see it, he's a highly mechanized force against a ragtag band of rebels. How that force is able to move, how that what powers a rebellion. Often there's a certain timeless element to that as well too. So while George Lucas is writing very much a reflection of the times that he's living in, and you could see that in Vietnam, you could also see it in the Cold War, what's happening in the Cold War at the time. He was at USC and actually learning a lot about like Joseph Campbell, the monomyth, and trying to create kind of like a modern fairy tale that would be in a galaxy far, far away. And so it's this intersection of all of these concepts. And I think that's kind of what makes that story really resonate with people. Just like I think some of the great fables and stories of myth that we have really keep with us even today, is that they have that truth that's in them. They have an ability to have they resonate with the reflection of where we are today. But they also, I think, allow people to kind of project themselves into the story, and almost at times either see themselves or see a challenge that they're engaged with, and learn a little bit about how they could deal with that challenge, or how to overcome something. And yeah, I think that Star Wars is a great mix of all of those things together.
So if I were to ask you if how would you describe how Star Wars works as a myth, like today for you?
Okay, so for me, and I'm gonna go back to how I grew up because I grew up with the original trilogy, and a big fan. Had Jeff knows this. Had my green broomstick. That was my lightsaber. So totally relate to that kid in The Last Jedi, which is almost a near meta level reference. Um, uh, how it really resonated with me when I was a young person was I knew of a lot of stories, especially older stories, that were about a youth that was kind of given a journey or a task that they had to go and pursue. In this case, it's kind of like Luke. I grew up in Modesto, just like George Lucas did, and was a farm boy that wanted to leave the farm. And say goodbye, dirt farming aunt and uncle. And like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, find this brand new world that you could go into. And Luke is kind of like a lot of those stories that I remember growing up in kind of like the myth of here is a young person that has to go on a perilous journey, that they get an advisor who themselves is somewhat flawed, in this case, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and is often trying to right the wrong of a past that of a wound or a trauma that occurred before their birth. And in this case, it's Luke going to try to deal with the Empire. And like the big threat that the Empire possesses and has out there. So at its base core, it's like it's that hero's journey with that big bad, dark villain, who represents just, the personification of evil. And it's a war. It's a battle against kind of the good, the light against the darkness, literally the light side of the force against the dark side of the force. That has that kind of like even magical element in it, that the more that Luke grows in his knowledge, the greater he becomes even more magical. So those were the kind of things that I saw when I was a kid, kind of growing up and thinking, oh wow, like this is what was attracting me to this story, and the mythical elements of it, where it's that kind of hero's journey out there.
Yeah, I was thinking, it's so, Ryan, I know we've talked about these. You've mentioned this story a few times, and I love it because it gets to this underlying feeling, I think, that allows any of us to connect to a book or a movie or whatever content we're consuming, and attach ourselves to it, like actually see ourselves in that, because it's I don't want to say it's a simple template, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
it's a template that can very easily be, anyone can abstract that on top of their own life on top of that template really easily without much friction. It's really easy to see yourself in the character of Luke, and make anything that he is doing or going through very analogous to things you've dealt with in your own life, and the perils and all the tribulations, the types of friends that you have. You can see, well, I've got these two friends that are very much like the Han Solo, and this other person who's like my Leia, or the Chewie, or like, you can see all these things. I was thinking earlier today about this from a little different perspective, on the myth question, which is, I was thinking sort of like in legend continuity, or going back into some of the books that have been written, of like what the basis of the Force is, and this whole idea of like 20,000 years before the Jedi sort of thing in the galaxy, you have the planet Tython, and this group of basically priests go to this place that is essentially a Force nexus, and they
Mm-hmm.
worship both the Ashla and the Bogon, what they kind of refer to before they called it light and dark. They didn't see it as light and dark; they saw it as different components of, they didn't even call it the Force, it was just different components of this energy that they could tell and see and feel, and they could manipulate and do things with it. And it wasn't until some later time when small groups decided that we really need to be more selfless and only focus on the Ashla, this selflessness type side. And then another group were like, no, 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 we really need to only focus on the Bogon, the selfishness and inward thinking and enrichment of ourselves and all this type of stuff. And when I thought about that earlier, I was like, it's interesting. I was actually watching a video that inspired this thought. It kind of reminded me of a lot of other mythology that we think of, not in that exact sense, but in how the stories of mythology, a lot of times are there to help us understand things that, whether they be science-based or that we could, research later on, or complex things, again, that they have a hard time wrapping our brains around logically, but it gives a good way to sort of like convey. It's almost a parable, like Psalms or something like that in the Bible, where it's conveying some complex message. It's not literally necessarily, in some cases, meant to be that truth, a literal truth. It's meant to be, understand this and what this is supposed to mean. That story of like these two sides opposing each other and then fighting each other because like I'm right and I'm right. It's like, well, yeah, you're both right, as it's a mutual right, but it's a different perspective. But you're trying to make it seem like there is only one. It's not a binary situation. It really isn't binary, but you're seeing it as binary because you've now like pushed yourself too far away from the nuance that does actually have to exist for people to coalesce with each other. And I don't know, that just kind of like, it got me thinking about the underlying premise of a lot of these stories in a whole new light.
We're digging deep tonight in the Kessel chat. I'm telling you, we're going into it.
Well, it's so awesome. I mean, what I'm hearing in both of you is kind of descriptions of imagining in to a different world, right? And the verb there is imagining. And so what's happening is through the joy of the story, we exercise our imaginations, right? And imagination is essential for problem solving, as we know, for creativity, right? So, I mean, that I personally think that's one of the functions of mythology, is to like give our imaginations a playground where we can, strengthen them and develop them for other things that we're gonna encounter in the quote real world, right?
It's interesting you say that, Joanna, because so often I think the word imagination is conflated with like children's like a vibrant child's mind, somebody who's a mind that is focused on making up things that don't actually exist for an entertainment value. And
it's like the negative side of dreamer,
yeah, exactly.
It's like, that person's a dreamer. They got their head in the clouds.
Yeah, head in the clouds. You got a strong imagination. It's like, why is that dismissed? Like, why would you say it in that sort of like, oh, you're just this thing? That's interesting how you bring that up, because we need our imagination to go through these things, to think of these. I mean, engineering is a really good place for that, because amongst many other things in STEM education, I think probably in general, but engineering is where I've always been. And like, it's a core part of how you can be a good engineer or good at the work that you do, or thoughtful at the work that you do, is imagining different ways that this problem could be approached and looked at, which will inspire you to come up with new ways to solve for the problem. It's why places like MIT and Stanford and Berkeley and other universities can produce the types of people that they do through these education systems, is because they encourage, this thoughtful exuberance to get out of your own way and like imagine a different way that this could be perceived or seen or whatever else. Not just, here, stare at a piece of paper, here's some math problems, work through them linearly, and then move on to something else.
Yep.
Yeah. And analogy is part of that too. An analogy is, what you're describing when you talk about, story and myth as a different way of understanding, not just knowing with like the frontal brain, but deep understanding. An analogy is a great way to exercise creativity as well, right? Like if you can take an engineering problem and say, oh, that's kind of like, I don't know, what's an engineering problem, like the gardening problem, I don't know, whatever. If you can draw the analogy, come up with new solutions potentially.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I there's also another side of this too, which one, like I just as a comment on the ability to have these things, these modern myths that we get to participate in, these modern fables that kind of teach us lessons and help us overcome problems. As a literal item, if anybody is following Picard management tips on Twitter, it's worth it. It's a Twitter account based as if Captain Picard was giving you class, A level management tips. It is hilarious, but also timeless, great advice. But on a more serious level, one of the things that I really like about Star Wars is and some of the elements of myth that I see that it has is and I could be wrong about this, but I feel like one of the great things about certain common parts of mythology is their ubiquitousness. Like the fact that you can kind of find them everywhere. It kind of allows people a common language sometimes, even if they're different characters and different stories, they're doing some of the same things. And I always think of I always come into this show and I start talking about Star Trek. There's a Star Trek episode.
Rich is very aware. Rich calls it out every single time you do. He's here to track it for us.
I am so sorry, Rich. It's the Kessel chat. It is not the Andorian chat. There's an episode though called Darmok. And it's like seriously my favorite Star Trek episode of all time. And Captain Picard's got to learn how to talk to someone, and this guy, he only can talk in metaphor. The example is like Juliet at her balcony. And he says Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, which is a totally different thing. But one of the examples in the episode is given is Juliet at her balcony, and that metaphor means romance. It could mean a lot of different things. And one of the things that I like about Star Wars is that it becomes a language that we can say. Where you can say things like, oh man, I felt like Luke in that trench run. This is as serious as Vader's your father. It's like, I love that there's a certain part of our like common understanding in a large part of the world where those stories are so like everybody knows them that you can reference them and convey meaning just from the reference.
Well, and not just meaning, but deep feeling, right? Like when you say, what was it? Luke in the trench. Oh. Was that when he was like shooting the thing at the end?
Oh yeah, he's going through the trench run to blow up the Death Star, and it's like it is one. Of course, yeah, scruffy looking nerf herder. Good job, Rich. That's a great comment. It is such a great feeling of just the stress and the worry and everything that goes into that last big push before you're gonna make it or not. I knew great reference.
Feeling. You said the words and I knew the feeling, even though, I'm sure I haven't seen the movies as many times as you have, right? But you communicated a whole experience with those 3 words because of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I was it's so interesting. I was listening to kind of touching back on the concept of you have to tell a type of truth in these stories, which is the basis for how anybody can connect to the example of Luke in the trench run, or standing out there in your hand, not the hand getting up, but learning that Vader's your father. Not that we're all going to learn somebody else is our father that we didn't know, but the emotion of learning this thing that that emotion we've all kind of been through. Neil Gaiman said, I've heard him say that when you're writing fiction or when you're telling stories, you have to tell your truth. The characters are all fictional. It's all completely made up. But you have to put your personal truth into that story, or else your audience will know. They will know that it is not your truth, and they will not connect with it, because at the end of the day, if there isn't truth to that story, no one can relate to it. There has to be. I mean, he talks about Coraline, one of his books, in like this alternate world and second mom and whatever else, because the kid's trying to get away from him, and there's a whole thing behind it. And he said, he never experienced that. He didn't have a second mom. He didn't have that childhood. But the feelings that character goes through, he definitely felt growing up. And so writing this character he's writing those feelings in that truth into a character set that's completely fictional. But anybody watching that can relate to the feeling that child is going through in the movie, whether they've experienced that exact action or not. I think Star Wars is very much the same way. We've talked about standalone movies like Solo, or even Rogue One, I think, is like the quintessential one for a lot of this, because there's so much that happens in Rogue One that we can feel, like a parent sacrificing for their children in a very particular set of ways, a child growing up in a certain set of ways and feeling like they've been shoved aside and ignored and whatever else, not realizing there's actually reasons for it. Whether they agree is not part of the fact that it did happen. Like in the Rogue One, Saw Gerrera leaving Jyn Erso behind. At a certain age, she was like, I was 16. He's like, people were becoming suspicious of you because you're linked to this Imperial person. I had to, or they were going to kill you. Well, she didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
He just did he go about it in the right way? No. Parents don't always go about these things in the right way, but there's a lesson to be learned. I mean, getting back to parenting thing is an easy one for parents, but if you're not for parents, like, you watch it and there's a truth there that we can all attach ourselves to, which is what I love so much about, and I think it's what they've done so well with Star Wars content. And I don't want to like put down like MCU content, Marvel Cinematic Universe content. I love that content too, but I don't always feel quite the same way with those stories. They're entertaining.
They were phoning it in on Thor 2 though, so it's cool.
Yeah, the Dark World, we just kind of like,
yeah, it didn't happen. It was
basically we learned who Thor was in Avengers, and we just jumped forward to Ragnarok, and we'll just kind of forget the rest of the stuff in the middle. But I love those movies because they're entertaining. All the content they put out is entertaining. The animated series and the books and things are probably more rich in story, but the movies they're just entertaining from my perspective. But Star Wars, for the most part, all the content they put out is so woven with each other that when you see these stories together, you can see so much more. Like, every single character they introduce has a meaning for the character to be there. They don't just shove characters in for the sake of it. It's part of this larger arc that's happening that makes you feel like you are there with them.
Yeah, go ahead, please, Joanna.
Well, no, I was wondering, so this larger arc you talk about, has it ended, or is it still going?
That's the interesting part about it is, no, it's still going. And even though when they ended, The Rise of Skywalker, the last movie came out, and that ended, at the end of it, she said, "Who are you, Rey Skywalker?" And, okay, we got a conclusion, cool, movie's over. Disney and Lucasfilm said that is the end of from a movie perspective or primary content perspective, that is the end of the Skywalker saga. We're not going to see any more movies or major productions that center on what we would call kind of the Skywalker era. And what I mean by that is stories that have a linchpin on characters like Luke, Leia, Han, Chewie, etc. Now, will those characters still show up in stories? I mean, absolutely. The books are in the house right now, but some of my comic books that I got from my store today in my pull list were War of the Bounty Hunters, and one of them is there's a conflict between Chewie and a particular character. So the stories are still being told. These nuanced pieces of stories are still being told about these characters, but it's not happening in the new content. So it's not happening in the timeline beyond what Rise of Skywalker did. So now what they're doing is going back into the midst of all this time period, the 35 or 40 years of what they call generally the Skywalker saga, where like pre-Clone Wars till Rise of Skywalker. And they're starting to pick apart and really dive into individual stories in that timeline to tell them in more detail. And in most cases, they're not about the Jedi. They're about individuals throughout the galaxy who probably never encountered a Jedi, because there's only 10,000 Jedi left by the time that happened. And we're talking an entire galaxy. So the likelihood of ever actually seeing or meeting a Jedi is like infinitesimally small. So there's all these other cool stories that happen to people. And I think that's where the mythos piece, mythology piece, is so much more interesting, because now you're really getting to see this from an individual person's perspective and how they view, maybe they've never even left their planet. That you got to imagine that most people probably never travel through space. It's expensive, and why would you need to? Like, it's not like just traveling to another city on a train. Like, there's got to be a big deal to go do it, because all the other stories we hear are so much from like, I jumped in hyperspace to this and hyperspace to that. But what about like the normal people who live on Tatooine, where Luke lived, as example? Like, they probably never left that planet. They would never even consider leaving that planet. They have no idea the drama that's happening in the galaxy. What are their stories?
That to me is like, and I'll say this. I remember when I was a kid, and I remember seeing that Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi were episodes 4, 5, and 6. And when I was a kid, George Lucas said, I'm not going to do episodes 1, 2, and 3. And then 1995 came along, and he said, I'm doing episodes 1, 2, and 3. And we were like, yeah! And so then episodes 1, 2, and 3 were done. 2005, George Lucas comes out, and he says, guys, I'm done. I've told the whole story. We're wrapped. And I was like, okay, hey, that was it's a nice circle. If you look at it as a circle of Anakin Skywalker being redeemed being a tragic hero and then being redeemed. End to end, great story. And then in what was it, 2013, 2014, we're gonna get 3 more movies again, and it was like, yeah, this is great. And it's kind of like being around friends that I hadn't seen in a while. I was so excited to like go back to that world, as see Han and Chewie again. Like, oh man, that Force Awakens trailer. There's the meme where it's the Matthew McConaughey from Interstellar, and he's crying because he's watching 23 years of videos or whatnot, but the meme is that he's watching the Force Awakens trailer. That could have just been me. I was like, this is glorious. Thank you for bringing these people back into my life again. It's funny, Jeff, when you were talking about the Lucasfilm standard is, oh, we're kind of done now. We're done. We're going to be focusing on other things. They've hired a bunch of people to come in and do different trilogies. But I always think that there's like a small spark that's there. And I think it really depends on if there's a good story to tell. I think with The Force Awakens, they actually knew a story that they wanted to tell. And whether or not they were able to kind of land it, it is what it is. But I think there might be some future where we're back sometime on Tatooine with a slightly older, maybe wiser, maybe jaded Rey, who is training maybe a new legion of Skywalkers, and not just Jedis. So yeah, I'm actually kind of hopeful that what's the old line, never say never again. Every time someone tells me this is it, we're done making, we're done with this story, it seems that if there is the right tale to be told, they'll make it. And so I'm kind of hopeful that the story does continue, because I totally agree. I think there is there's opportunity. There's more to learn in this world.
So 2 things. One is kind of a tap off of what you just said, and then I have a question for you, Joanna, on some of these, to kind of bring it back to some mythology type components here. Or more so than we did in the last few minutes, is what you just said, Ryan. I'm remembering the end of The Last Jedi, and you mentioned it earlier, the child coming out and lifting the broom with the Force and then sweeping the floor, and you're like, you see that, and you're like, oh! I remember being in the theater, and I was like, my elbows are on my knees watching this. My wife's next to me, and then I saw it a second time. Even the second time I saw it with like my team from work, and a couple people were like, "Hey Jeff, what's bad?" I'm like, just. I'm like, I got a whole lot of shh with your name on it, and I'm on my elbows on my knees, and it happens again. I'm like, oh! And for me, it was like, it took me a little bit to kind of process that, but when it was done, I'm with you. That could have been an ending. That could have been a fantastic ending right there, because then your imagination can just there's more here, but we don't need to see it. We just know that there is more there. It may not be out for us to know. Almost like we've talked about this before, the idea of sort of like in the Dark Tower series, when Roland is on the drawing of 3, when he's out on the beach and there's 3 doors on the beach of the Western Sea or whatever, and he opens up a door and there's another world. You're seeing a story happen, and at some point you need to see that story. Close that door, and you can't open that story. You don't need to keep the story is continuing, but you've seen what you need to see to make it interesting, entertaining, what have you. And I love that. We could go back to that, but that whole idea of stopping the series or stopping a story when it's told enough, because you don't need to just keep telling it till we reach the theme and then that's it. You don't always have to do that, which I think is missed. I think a lot of times by certain types of storytellers. But to switch gears for a sec, Joanna, I have a question for you. So we've talked a lot about a variety of components of stories and things like that. And one thing I'm actually really curious about is, in history, how analogous is, if at all, is this idea of, and we talked about this earlier pre-show, about the idea of, Disney bought all this intellectual property and, or bought, Lucasfilm and LucasArts and all this type of stuff, and kind of decanonized, so to speak, everything that had been done before, so they could kind of start fresh with their own version of stories, even though they're still actively tapping on things that have been done in Legends. And it makes me really curious, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm just going to ask it anyway, has that sort of activity happened throughout cultures with their mythologies? I know what the answer is, but I'm leading you up here. Has that happened? And what have been some of the drivers for, why that has happened? But I think also as important is, how did that benefit a society by being able to do that and add on to or manipulate over time or explore in more detail something that you thought, oh, like some people call it like retconning, where, oh, they explore it and then they're just changing it. It's like, it's not always a change. It's sometimes maybe we're exploring and learning something that we didn't really understand before. I know it's a lot to unpack there, but I'm super curious your thoughts on it.
I mean, that's a couple of dissertations right there. So, I mean, I will say that, like, for starters, I think it's probably true to say that most sacred stories, most stories that have meant a lot to a lot of people have not been canonized, right? They've been more dynamic and more responsive to changing needs of the society or the individual, or the metaphysical function, which I feel like you were alluding to a second ago, that like, that idea that there's more there than we know about even in reality, right? But I mean, the idea of canonization, the first thing I think of course, is the Bible. The Catholic Church sat down and said, this is in, this is out, this is in, this is out. And there were sacred texts that didn't make it in, right? And the Bible hasn't stayed exactly the same since the Council of Nicaea. I mean, the Bible is a sacred text. It's the book of a religion, and it also has a lot of the dynamics at play that mythology does. So that, to me, is kind of the prime example. I feel like I've lost track of your question a little bit, but is that what you were getting?
Absolutely. And I think the addendum to that was sort of knowing that these things do change. Why do new people want to come in and contribute that and like add to it or manipulate it or change it? And does that actually help? Does that actually aid in the mythology growing, or does it actually cause issues with the understanding of the mythology? Does it break it down at all? I'm actually really curious about that, because so many times over like the Legends of Continuity, there were different books that were written that sometimes they directly contradict each other by two different authors, but most of the time what I notice is that they just showed a character in a slightly different way. They're like, wait, but I thought Luke was X, or I thought this other character was Y, because I read something, and now I'm kind of seeing that character someplace else. This doesn't feel like it really is that character anymore. And it was clear at that time because they were two completely different authors, and the checks and balances in place, or the level of control Disney has over the story arc today wasn't there. Some can argue that's good or bad, but I think it's helpful because it does allow the characters to be developed out in a particular fashion, so that no matter which new author adds to that and contributes their own voice to it, we're not changing the underlying person or story that happens to be there. We're just growing it. But I'm curious, has that always been the case with various mythologies, and does it harm or hinder, or is it sort of a mix of both?
Well, so when there's two stories and they don't seem like the same character, a couple things come up for me. Like, one is, can we be okay with a character like being very different, right? Like that's kind of a big psychological question. Like, can we be okay with complexity? Can we be okay with contradiction? Can we be okay with both sides of the coin being up at the same time? So that's a really interesting line of thought. And but the whole exercise we're talking about having a canon, and people are all contributing, and there's kind of a board announcing or assigning tasks and stories to people. I feel like this is a pretty new experiment in mythology, and the test is gonna be time. Like, which of these stories hold up? Will people be reading these stories in 20 years? And if so, which ones? Which are the ones that are going to survive? Like, mythology, it's sort of like a living being. Like, there's almost like the dynamic of evolution at play, right? Like, if it has strong genes, it'll survive, and it'll have offspring. Like Star Wars is clearly doing, right? And the offspring, if they're strong, they'll survive and they'll have offspring. And so you just kind of have to step back and look and watch over time and see what happens. To see what works.
Yeah, it's fascinating you say, because as you were talking, I'm thinking back to myself, like, on the surface, thinking back, well, Greek mythology, Romans, the Sumerians, whatever cultural group that existed in antiquity or in history in general that had what we would call a mythology, or maybe not a religion, what have you. I'm thinking back to that, and my first thought is like, oh well, yeah, but those things aren't in practice. But like our time period where we've had the religions or the mythologies, let's say Star Wars, for example, it's 50 years. I mean, 40, 50 years. I mean, it hasn't been that long. And you look back, if I stop and actually let myself process the Greeks, the Romans, the Sumerians, any other antiquity-based cultural group, like you think about that from like they were around a lot longer as a group and had a mythology that developed out over time than Star Wars as an example has existed. So yeah, you're totally right that like these things just probably have to ebb and flow over a period of time and have to change, I would imagine, to keep up with the culture that they're serving, because the culture they serve day one is not the same group of people they're going to serve 200 years later or 150 years later. It's people are different, and they're going to change over time with different generations, and the economies around them, and the world's changing, and agrarian society's changing into, or hunter-gatherer moving into agrarian, and all these types of things are changing. It's going to affect how the story is going to have to shape out to fit the culture they exist.
Yeah, and if you legislate it, if you say this story can't change, you're heading for some psychological difficulties.
I think that's actually one of the things that kind of hurts fandom sometimes, is kind of a demand to have to hold to canon. Because actually I think that demand, and we talk about the differences of some of these tales, and I think that sometimes it's not a matter of like, I want this character to change as much as these are often reflections of the teller. And you look at like religion, for example, a great example of the effect of the teller, the effect of the person who is engaging with the material, having it themselves reflect in it, is your ability to look at any religious figure and think they would vote like me. It's that ability to try to like project yourself into that, and then when you tell that tale, you're keeping those values that you want to tell. You're perceiving the elements that you want to see. Just like how we were talking about Star Wars, you could see it as a reflection of the Cold War, and maybe the evil empire is the Soviet Union in that. And the freedom fighting rebels are, the United States. Likewise, you can also see it as a parable for Vietnam, with a highly mechanized U.S. Army against, again, a very ragtag bunch. And so it's often, I think, with all of these things, is that the meaning is in the eye of the beholder. And because of that, the way that the tale is told is often a reflection of the values of the teller, whether they're aware of it or not. And it happens with religion. It's why why Jesus can be a Republican and a Democrat. It happens with philosophies all around the world. And I think that's kind of what makes some of these elements a little timeless, is because they are used as cornerstones for multiple people to take multiple points. To say, look, there's an example of how I'm right. And yeah, you see that in myth, you see that in religion. I always think a lot of that stuff is often very much a reflection of the teller. Even in the oral tradition of how some of these stories were told.
It's Ryan, it's interesting you say. The thought that actually crossed my mind was what you just described right there is almost analogous to, and it's probably, since I've never been in a courtroom, I don't actually know how it plays out. I can just say what I've seen on TV, but I've got to imagine these situations where someone, a lawyer, tells someone on the stand, read this section of a piece of text for me, like read these 2 sentences right here, and then they say it, and then they use that as part of a story that they are telling about how, and they're leaving out context intentionally, whether it's for good or for ill, is all a matter of the perspective of the person looking at the situation, because there is no one right or wrong, but that's part of a story. Like it's part of what's happening. If you don't allow for that to happen, then it makes the whole situation a lot more complicated to deal with, because then you have to deal with a whole bunch of other context that then has to be completely broken down by everybody to figure out, is there an objective truth to this? There rarely is an objective truth. Like other than saying gravity works, so something falls to the ground, like there's very few like objective truths or like unified truths that everyone just knows is just true. There's very few of them. Like everything is contextualized, and that it's such a good point that like if we don't allow the teller of a particular story to not manipulate, but to adjust the truth that they tell about a person based off of their own background, we're doing a disservice to the story. Because at the end of the day, the story is meant to convey something to an audience. It's not meant to just retell the exact same thing that somebody else has already told. Who wants to read that? That doesn't sound interesting in any way, shape, or form.
No, Jeff. I remember an old Jedi saying that the many of the truths we cling to depend on our own certain point of view. The story that Obi-Wan tells
my God,
about
Obi-Wan.
He's Luke, your father. He was betrayed.
Ben,
and,
why did you tell me Darth Vader was my father? Well,
father.
He is or wasn't from a certain point of view. You're like, dude.
A certain point of view. Yeah. And granted, that's some really great wordsmithing for them to get out of that hole. But the real thing is there isn't anything more true than that. That many of the truths that we cling to are tied to our point of view. And that said, it was a total lie, and Obi-Wan is gaslighting Luke. I've said it in the past. He is possibly a villain in this story. But yeah, it's the point of view. It's when you're dependent on forebears telling you the truth about things, it's not the truth, it's their version of it. And that's why it is so interesting, especially now in this modern world, that we have things like movies, books, all these other things, because people are so tied to the oral history of things. But even then, people can find these little truths that they can make out of it and say, that's what I think that this means. And in my point of view, that's the real story going on here.
Well, and aren't lies like that very valuable for teaching a certain healthy skepticism, right?
Mm-hmm,
because stories are slippery. Stories can convey truth and they can convey lies. They can very powerfully convey lies. And so I think especially when we're in these realms of the not quite real, it behooves us to kind of keep our wits about us and pay attention and, really say, okay, what's going on here? And when you step back and take a look, you have a better sense, I hope, of a better chance of being able to tell what's adaptive and what's not adaptive, right? What's useful, what's not useful. What's fun, what's not.
I love that so much, Joanna, because I think everything you just said right there encapsulates everything we hope to do with this live stream, which is to help our audience, help anybody who's interested in Star Wars, wants to learn more about it, wants to read, to enjoy it, not because these are just entertaining. And they are. There's a huge entertainment value by doing it. But because they do the stories do challenge you and your perspectives in a particular set of ways, in many ways, sometimes in just one way. And if you allow yourself to see that and sit back and go, okay, hold on a second. What were they actually trying to get across there? It opens your mind to other ways of seeing a situation play out, which again is basically an allegory for how to view the natural world around you, how to view situations you deal with at work and other places. It actually gives you more. It's kind of teaching you how to be more. I don't want to say patient. I think that's too oversimplified. But it teaches you a bit more of an ability or practiced ability to say, what am I not seeing here? What have I missed, or what things am I not aware of that could be happening that I can't control and I may never actually know? Does that actually help the story? If not, and in the real world, that could help. I mean, for all of us, at work, that can help a ton when something happens and someone reacts a way to you or doesn't say something to you or what have you. The instinct is to go, wait, what do you mean? What did I do? Oh God, and internalize the entire thing, as opposed to sitting back and saying, what else is at play here that I don't know, I may never know, and may have absolutely nothing to do with me whatsoever. I am not this is not a Jeff-centric universe. But it is for you in the moment, and I think that's what good stories and myths actually, or mythologies, can do, is teach people, if they allow themselves to see it that way, teach people how to practice the skill of being aware that there is other things that are at play. You may learn them and you may not, and appreciate that.
I love that. What am I not seeing here? That's great.
Well, this has been awesome. We've gone again super long, which is fantastic. Which is like
Oops.
no. It's great. Like Ryan and I think when we originally started this, we had intended to do like we'll do 30 minutes and we can do it. And then I think we very quickly realized that like that's not a thing. Like we just all have way too much to say.
Yeah, I mean that said, like it's my favorite thing is when I'll look up and I'm like, oh my gosh, what time is it? It is my favorite thing that happens is when we'll get kind of lost in the conversation. What's great about this too is I had made a lot of notes on things to bring up. Joanna, I feel like we got to have you come back because I wanted to talk about a lot of other things too that were like reflections of like things that I like build upon. I like how you talked about build upon because George Lucas was a real he was a very studious filmmaker. He looked at other films, he looked at other stories and tried to bring some of those elements into his story until the point when he had cut something out enough that he had to build its own mythology internally. Some of it was good, like Revenge of the Jedi becoming Return of the Jedi when he realized a Jedi wouldn't do revenge. Some of it was bad, like midi-chlorians. Don't take the magic away of the Force. I don't need a scientific reason why they can talk to the Force. It's just there. I feel like, though, it's been great just having like a natural flowing conversation about like how much these stories mean to us and kind of why they mean so much to us, which I feel like is the heart of why myths live on from the dawn of time to now. So this has been great.
It'd be awesome to have you back, Joanna, as many times as you want to come back. And you just touched on it, right? And I think that's one of like the next big things we should get into is why is it that mythologies resonate with us? Why is it that we crave these types of stories as people? Like, why do they affect us so much? And how can we do more of that? How can we use more of that just in general?
That is what I am all about. That's the flag I fly.
Fantastic. Well, Joanna,
I gotta say, so Ryan, you mentioned that Star Trek episode Darmok.
Oh yeah.
Right? So yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, it is one of my favorite episodes. One of the greatest parts about it. And again, I'm sorry, Rich. I know that I'm going into back into Star Trek. But Darmok is one of these great episodes for multiple reasons. One, I love stories about communication, and that is a story that's entirely about communication. It's also the antithesis of Star Trek, the original series episode, where Kirk runs into a guy and decides his guy is a Gorn. He looks like a lizard, and Kirk is like, I gotta fight this guy. Captain Picard, being the natural diplomat he is, he says, I've got to learn to talk to this person. And there is a certain amount of Robinson Crusoe where it's like they're learning each other's language, and the captain, the alien captain tells Picard this story of Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. And it is a story about two people that are opposites, that are from different lands, coming together on an island of Tanagra and learning to work together and then leave together. And that captain is trying to do that with Picard, so that way they can forge a line of communication. And Picard, and once he realizes, oh, you use your myths as in metaphors to communicate emotions, feeling. Timber, his arms wide, means I'm trying to give you something. Shaka, when the walls fell, that means something bad has happened. And so Picard, realizing that, learns the language and then tells the story of Gilgamesh to the other captain as a means by which to share their own stories of legend. And what's the best part of this entire episode is the viewer unknowingly has learned the aliens are called the Children of Tama. By the end of the episode, Picard has to come back up on the ship and tell the aliens that their captain has died. Spoilers, sorry. And he tells them in their language, and because the viewer's been a part of this journey, you don't need subtitles at the end. When he comes up onto the bridge and he's talking to him, he says, Shaka when the walls fell. And you as the viewer have learned this other alien language that is filled with metaphors that are, although you don't know their specificity, you know their meaning. And it is one of my favorite, like, not just Star Trek episodes, anybody, I'm sorry if I spoiled it for anybody, but it is one of the best science fiction episodes of anything ever. Darmok, great episode.
Send you the link. So I help organize a conference for mythologists, and there's a presentation at this year's conference on that episode. Oh
my gosh!
Yeah. So and
that is awesome.
It's like, yeah, I'll send you the link. Oh. But if anyone's watching, they can go to myth2021.com for information.
What Joanna just said. Matter of fact, if you look, everyone watching, not anybody, everybody watching, if you check out the comments, the description section below of the video, you will find a link to that, the conference website, and everywhere you can find Joanna. Joanna, anything you want to, any little call to action you want to give everyone before we wrap it up?
To call to action. I don't know. Keep mything.
That is a great tagline. What was the conference website again?
Myth2021.com. So 2021.
Awesome. So if anyone's interested, go there and
Mythologium.
Perfect. And Joanna, where can the audience find you online?
Oh, what am I? On Twitter, I am Enchantery, and my website is joannagardner.com. So that one's pretty easy.
Right on. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate having you on the show.
Yeah, good deal.
Super fun.
Awesome.
Super fun. Thank you. Great conversation.
Yeah, well, and we will definitely have you back.
Awesome.
Yep. And for everyone watching, thank you so much for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. Ryan, should we wrap up?
Yeah, special call out to Rich because I spoiled Darmok for him. I'm really sorry about that, Rich.
I'm sure he's totally broken up about it.
No, he's the best. He is a regular viewer. Really appreciate it. But yeah, thank you, Rich, for sticking around with us.
We appreciate it. And for just so you know, we have fans like Rich who are in the UK, so it is 4:20 in the morning right now for Rich. And just awesome, dude. Thank you so much for being here. And for everyone else watching, we really appreciate having you. If you want to follow up with us, just put it in the comments below. Hit subscribe, subscribe, hit the little bells. All those things help the channel. We will see you next Thursday. Have a great night.
Good deal. Good night, everybody.